What the hell? No, not gonna get involved. No. Damn it. What are you doing now?
I am going to make predictions. Be warned, though. Predictions are difficult, especially predictions about the future. What? I'm just covering my butt in case I'm wrong.
Can you predict how pretentious you're about to get?
Quiet, you. I have divined that 3 paths are open to America. 3 paths from this moment in history.
You sound like a politician. Every election, they're always America's at a crossroads.
America is at a crossroads.
Oh, don't start.
Too late.
Fine. What are you predicting?
The future of America and the fate of the Republican Party. America's fate will be determined by what the G.O.P. does and how Americans respond to it. Before considering the future of the Republican Party, we have to understand how it has evolved over the last few decades. From 1932 to 1994, the Democratic Party was dominant. While Republicans successfully competed for the presidency, they held the Senate for only 10 years in that time, and the House only 4 years. Democratic dominance was enabled by their successful response to the challenges of the Great Depression and World War II. Republican governing philosophy was so thoroughly rejected at the ballot box that the 75th Congress, elected in 1936, gave Democrats a 3-1 supermajority in both houses. When you've got those kinds of numbers, you can get things done. This was the New Deal era. During this time, Democrats established new fiscal policy, set a minimum wage, pursued monetary reform, wrote banking and securities regulations, built infrastructure, expanded housing, created Social Security, and granted workers the right to organize on their own terms. But even with majorities like that, there were limits. Ostensibly, the United States has a 2-party system. In practice, each party is composed of a number of powerful factions that, in a multi-party system, would be independent political parties. That's why so many of us on the left are constantly disappointed by Democrats. They're a coalition, everyone in it has different priorities, but my priorities are the best, so listen to me. Anyway, in the New Deal era, conservative Democrats based in the American South and the states of the old Confederacy often aligned with the Republican Party to restrict attempts to expand labor rights and the welfare state. Why? Because they came from racist single-party states. As a result, early Social Security did not cover workers in agriculture, domestic service, or government employees, since in the South, those workers were usually black. Minimum wage laws did not apply to workers whose incomes came from tips, which again, in the South, were primarily black Americans. Then, as now, Republicans were ideologically opposed to using government to improve American lives. Southern Democrats did want to help their constituents, but only the white ones. If a program would help black people too, they opposed it. And the politicians weren't just being racist bastards for no reason. They were representing racist constituents. Although, to be honest, most Americans were pretty racist back then. But we're talking about people who would be happy to go without housing assistance and live in a cardboard box under a bridge, as long as the black family living under the same bridge didn't have a cardboard box. After World War II, liberal and moderate Democrats began pushing civil rights reforms. This alienated conservative Democrats so much that in 2 of the next 6 elections they ran their own candidate against the Democratic nominee, and in 1 just ran unpledged electors in the hope of sabotaging the election. Southern conservatives were not, on their own, powerful enough to maintain white supremacy, but in the 1960s they discovered potential allies in the Republican Party. Conservatives had achieved some remarkable successes in the G.O.P., getting their chosen candidate, Barry Goldwater, nominated for the presidency in 1964. Though the nation as a whole rejected Goldwater, Goldwater's rejection of federal efforts to expand civil rights won him 5 former Confederate states.
So, this Goldwater guy was racist?
Far from it. He was a member of the NAACP, he integrated his family's business, he pushed for integration of public schools in his hometown, Phoenix. When elected to represent Arizona in the United States Senate, he got the Senate cafeteria desegregated.
Then how in the hell did he become the champion of Southern racists?
He voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Why?
He felt that people should be able to run their businesses as they saw fit, and that states should decide whether to integrate. He said, "You can't legislate morality."
which is why there are no laws against theft or murder. Was he rich?
His family did own a chain of department stores.
I'd call that a big yes. The rich never care about other people.
Well, rich people, at least the ones we would call the 1%ers, had seen their income tax rates increase tenfold in the 1940s. It used to be that income taxes were only really noticed by millionaires, but that changed with the New Deal and World War II. Upper-class Americans went from paying tax rates of 2 or 3% to 25% or more, and that persisted into the 50s and the 60s. In the 70s, the 1%ers began to strike back. They did so by harnessing discontent. Goldwater's nomination was a disaster for the GOP in the general election. Democrats held the White House and won 2/3 majorities in Congress. But in the following years, discontented conservatives were finding ways to link up behind the scenes and gather their power. A man named Richard Viguerie ran the largest conservative direct mail operation. Any conservative interest group could hire him to send his missives to millions of mailboxes and instantly generate outrage on the group's behalf. Paul Weyrich, a supporter of Barry Goldwater, founded a network of institutions tasked with producing rational-sounding bases for conservative policies. The Heritage Foundation and the American Legislative Exchange Council were his progeny. They were created to counter actual policy think tanks like the Brookings Institute, because policy recommendations based on real-world data were hostile to conservative goals. After all, reality has a well-known liberal bias. Weyrich freely admitted that he and other members of the New Right, which is what they called themselves, weren't really conservatives. They were working to overturn the power structure of the United States. The New Right organized discontent, meaning generating outrage was their primary goal. Policy and ideas were not that important. In fact, policy was so unimportant that conservative magazine Human Events claimed in 1977 that conservatism could only prosper by opposing liberalism. That's right. Owning the libs is as old as disco. This indifference to policy and embrace of outrage persisted and intensified in the late 80s with the proliferation of hard-right talk radio, and then the late 90s with the advent of Fox News. These media operations made conservative Americans hostile to other Americans. By the early Obama years, conservatism had left policy behind. Today's conservatism is the opposite of what liberals want today, updated daily. That brings us to the present.
With the Republican Party as full-blown fascists.
Perhaps not full-blown, but the largest faction within the party is fascist.
Not full-blown? Can we at least agree that Republicans blow?
The present moment is extremely dangerous. You've probably heard people listing the features of fascism and how the Republican Party matches up with them.
Yeah, it's spooky.
Most of those lists aren't particularly useful. Historian Robert Paxton points out that fascism doesn't have a founding philosopher, there's no canonical texts for it, and there's no one true way to be fascist. Each country, each culture develops its own variety.
All the same, I'll never forgive them for importing fascism from Europe to the United States.
Fascism is not a European invention. It was born right here in the form of the Ku Klux Klan.
Oh, God damn it.
The Klan functioned as Democratic Party paramilitary forces in the former Confederate states. Their goal? Deprive black Americans of the vote. When Democrats took control of state governments, they established single-party political systems, with the Klan always ready to intimidate and destroy potential opposition. When fascist movements arose in Europe, they too had paramilitary forces on which they could call.
This is why we can't have nice things.
Today's Republican Party has a paramilitary wing in the form of the Proud Boys and the 3%ers. What Paxton calls mobilizing passions are present.
What the hell is a mobilizing passion?
A view of one's group as a pure group sharing a common conviction that reinforces individual self-esteem. A group whose members are obedient to a leader who alone incarnates the group's destiny. The embrace of violence to further the group's goals. The simultaneous primacy and victimhood of the group, and a dread of decadence.
Well, you certainly have no dread of decadence.
The first time you called me decadent, I was so shocked I nearly spilled my absinthe. Now it bores me. Anyway, I would argue that 2/3 of the GOP is fully fascist. They have bought into Trump's big lie that the 2020 election was stolen, even though all the available evidence indicates otherwise. This is one of the most interesting things about the conservative movement, the willingness to embrace the lies they are told. Unlike ordinary people, conservatives like being lied to. They want to be conned. While most human beings would rather be comfortable than correct, conservatives take this to a whole new level. When I was younger, I wanted to understand the conservative point of view. I familiarized myself with conservative media and noticed a disturbing pattern. Alongside articles and stories that were obvious fabrications, there were ads for obvious con jobs. Get-rich-quick schemes, penny stocks, gold investments, miracle cures, tax-evading trust funds. As a young woman, I turned away from this universe of lies, feeling like they had insulted my intelligence. Now that I'm older, I'm so old. What am I doing? Who will listen to me? Perhaps no one, but it's still worth making the effort. In any case, though fascism is hard to define, today's Republican Party bears many of the hallmarks of fascism. Paxton writes that the first stage of fascism is very common. Often, there are thought leaders decrying the failures of liberal democracy. The second stage is rooting, when a fascist movement functions as a viable political party. In Depression-era France, Germany, and Italy, this started in rural areas when the parties on the right, for which rural people usually voted, could no longer wield power alone, but refused to accept an ascendant left as a legitimate governing partner. Successful fascist parties positioned themselves as the most effective barrier against the left. This is happening with the Republican Party today. Rural Americans have been propagandized into believing that other Americans are the enemy if they support workers' rights or civil rights or if they aren't white or male or Christian. Republicans have no policies. They did not write a party platform in 2020. They simply oppose everything the left wants. In the 1930s, fascism did not triumph in the United States because, through a coalition of conservative Democrats and Republicans, conservative elites still wielded a respectable amount of power. It did not triumph in France because conservatives never felt sufficiently threatened. It did not triumph in Britain because the Conservative Party was still electorally competitive. And in none of these countries did conservatives reject the legitimacy of their rival parties' governance. So why is American fascism ascendant in the 21st century when it failed in the 20th? Because America is now different. In the 1930s, almost half of Americans lived in rural areas. Now less than 1/5 do. In the 1930s, 9 in 10 Americans were white. Now it's down to 2 in 3. In the 1930s, the federal government did almost nothing to protect the civil rights of non-whites. Now there is a civil rights division of the Department of Justice. Republican voters have been radicalized by their leaders in politics and the media. They want to preserve an idealized America, the perfect vision they retain in their memories. But they have been told that if they want things to stay as they are, things will have to change.
Like democracy, it will have to go.
Republicans see political opposition as illegitimate. If democracy allows illegitimate parties to come to power, then democracy is flawed and must be cast aside.
They want to make Trump a damn king.
No, they want us to stay a republic. How many times have you heard a conservative say, "We're a republic, not a democracy"? They say that because of their contempt for democracy. They want an authoritarian hyper-capitalist republic like China, or a corrupt oligarchic republic like Russia, or a theocratic republic like Iran. And they are dangerously close to getting it.
How close?
Conditions are right for what Paxton calls the third stage of fascism, coming to power in cooperation with conservative elites. This is usually done through wholly legitimate means, although violence from fascist paramilitaries beforehand weakens the existing power structure. Conservative elites embrace fascists as a last-ditch effort to hold power against an advancing left whose legitimacy they refuse to recognize.
So what happens?
As I said, there are 3 futures depending on how Americans respond to Republican actions. One possible future is that Republicans will triumph. This future is made possible by Democratic Party paralysis and media indifference. There are fewer conservative Democrats than ever before, but given the thin majorities in Congress, they hold the balance of power. In this future, conservative Democrats join with Republicans to prevent the implementation of popular policies. I'm not talking about a direct collaboration. Pro-filibuster senators such as Joe Manchin appear to have tied their identities to displays of independence, sacrificing reliability and trustworthiness in order to establish their brand. No principle seems to be involved. Defenders of the filibuster have never presented a coherent rationale for their stance. They block reform because they can, and because they can continue to draw a 6-figure income without having to do any work or take any tough votes. Meanwhile, major media outlets have not done a good job of informing the American public of the unique threat to democracy that the Republican Party presents. A recent poll found that 7 out of 8 Americans are worried that American democracy is in trouble, but only half of Americans are aware that Republican voter suppression is an attack on democracy. So, in this future... In this future, voter suppression measures are in full force in the 2022 midterms. Republicans regain control of Congress. There is a flurry of investigations into the Biden administration. All the investigations are bullshit, but they drive down Biden's poll numbers. With Congress blocking every Democratic initiative, the domestic economy deteriorates, and Biden gets the blame. Donald Trump runs again, and in the 2024 election, Biden and Trump are both unpopular. Vote suppression and Democratic disappointment keep millions of potential Biden voters at home. In this scenario, Trump could conceivably win the vote, although given his deep unpopularity, a much more likely outcome is he once again comes in second. But since the president is elected by the Electoral College, Republican-dominated states may choose to resolve vote-counting disputes by ignoring the results and selecting GOP electors. There are any number of ways, legal or extra-legal, that the counting of votes could be disrupted or halted, presenting opportunities for state officials to step in and declare the result they want. In fact, it will be to the GOP's advantage to sow chaos and doubt for precisely that reason. Another approach that Republicans have already tested is the January 6th certification of votes by Congress. Even after the storming of the Capitol, Republicans were willing to challenge election results reported from the states. It is likely that, on January 6th of 2025, a Republican Congress will refuse to certify a Democratic victory. This is a dangerous scenario. In 2000, the vote was close enough that Democrats acquiesced when the Supreme Court appointed George W. Bush to the presidency. In 2016, Trump's margins of victory in the deciding states were clear enough that there was no basis for a challenge. But in the current political climate, if Republicans intervene to change the results of the election, it is difficult to imagine any but the most conservative Democrats going along. Whatever shenanigans take place, Trump and his new vice president are sworn into office on January 20th. After that, Republicans will have full authority over the federal government. I think a good historical example of this coming about is apartheid-era South Africa. In the 1948 election, South Africa's United Party defeated the Conservative National Party by 11 points. But because of the way electoral districts were drawn, the National Party won control of the government. This is very similar to the advantages gerrymandering has given Republicans in the United States. Once the National Party was in power, it continued to rely on these gerrymandered districts to remain in power. In 1953, the National Party won only 49% of the vote, but obtained nearly 60% of the seats. After this election, the National Party reformed election law to disenfranchise more voters, making it even easier for them to hold on to power. The National Party remained in control of South Africa for over 40 years, only surrendering power after decades of increasing internal resistance and international condemnation. One way Republican fascism would be different from European fascism is that elections would be less of a sham and more of an empty formality. Yes, there would still be elections. These days, when authoritarian governments replace democratic ones, they create what we call competitive authoritarian systems. There are still elections, but the ruling party has gamed the system so that the opposition can never come to power. All the real disputes are resolved within the ruling party before a general election takes place. This is what has happened in Hungary. After the right-wing Fidesz party won the 2010 elections, they took steps to appoint friendly judges, pressured private media organizations to sell their assets to pro-government groups, and politicized formerly non-partisan posts in the bureaucracy. Similar developments have taken place in Poland, where the right-wing Law and Justice Party has been in control since 2015. Both parties oppose civil rights for disfavored groups such as ethnic minorities, non-Christians, women, and LGBT individuals. If the Republicans win the elections of 2022 and 2024, it is entirely possible they will take America in this direction. Republican control will create years of human misery both within and beyond America's borders, especially as climate change worsens.
Holy shit. Do you really think that could happen?
That is a worst-case scenario. If everything goes right for them, they will be in a position to seize power and hold it for decades. A party that doesn't believe government can be used to solve problems, and doesn't believe the problem of climate change exists, will make zero effort to meet the challenges of climate change.
So a single political party might destroy the world?
A single person may already have destroyed the world. When the Supreme Court issued its decision making George W. Bush president, Sandra Day O'Connor was the deciding vote. Because of her, we lost most of a decade in which we could have been doing something about environmental collapse.
Shit. Wait a minute. You said there were 3 futures.
Yes, there are other paths for America and for the GOP. Under ordinary circumstances, when a political party finds itself losing elections, it alters its political positions to appeal to a wider range of voters, moving to wherever the political center of gravity is at the time. We saw the Democrats do this in the late 20th century. They ran liberal candidates in 1968 and 1972 and lost, then won in 1976 with a more conservative candidate. They lost again in 1980, ran more liberal candidates in 1984 and 1988, then again won in 1992 with a more conservative candidate. Republicans have rejected this approach. They instead have moved away from the center, further and further right, in order to win larger numbers of fringe voters. Votes on the fringes are not as plentiful as votes in the center, so the party has had to move pretty far to the right to cobble together a coalition that can win elections. When they still had party platforms, the GOP's political positions were profoundly unpopular. That is why they no longer campaign on issues at all. Instead, they talk about Dr. Seuss, cancel culture, wokeness, and critical race theory. They are not going to come out and admit that all they want is to cut taxes for the wealthy and for large corporations. Instead, they complain that women and non-whites and poor people and the gays have had it too good for too long. Given how far the Republican Party has moved from the political center of the United States, it is possible that Trump represents their high watermark. Trump's popularity fell nearly 6 points in the immediate aftermath of the January 6th insurrection. Given how tightly the GOP clings to Trump, his unpopularity could easily become theirs. Why? Because we already see that all they have to sell is used Trumpism. After previous defeats, they've studied why they lost and considered changes. They're not doing that this time. They no longer recognize electoral defeat as possible. So it's just going to be a rerun of the 2016 race every 4 years until the sun burns out. They can only win by rigging future elections. What can stop them? There's a few possibilities. Perhaps conservative Democratic senators are finally persuaded to abolish the filibuster, thereby allowing Democrats to pass popular legislation. It's possible that criminal prosecutions related to January 6th will tear through the ranks of Republican elected officials, discrediting the party as a whole. And of course, it's possible that Trump himself may be indicted and become, shall we say, unavailable in the 2024 election. In this future, when November 2022 rolls around, the public at large is satisfied with Democratic governance and revolted by Republican outrages. Democrats hold their House seats and pick up a Senate seat or two. In 2024, voters reward Biden with a second term, maybe even with Florida, Georgia, and Texas in play. Democrats pick up 25 or 30 House seats and another Senate seat. So in 2025, we have a Democratic Party in power that, for the first time, is primarily composed of members subject to racism and sexism or ideologically opposed to both. For the first time, the country can reckon with white supremacy. The Republican Party refuses to move to the center, continuing its ongoing appeal to fringe voters. The party shrinks. Republicans have diminished and sprung back before, but in the 19th century, a few American political parties appeared and disappeared. The Federalist Party had been the dominant party for the first dozen years under the 1787 Constitution, but once they lost power, they began to shrink, unable to appeal to the broader electorate. The Whigs followed a similar trajectory, existing as a competitive national party for about 20 years before disagreements over slavery policy fractured the party. The Republican Party was originally founded in part by disaffected Northern Whigs. If the party follows the path of the Federalists or the Whigs, it is likely to become a regional party, concentrated roughly in the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountain states, and in the middle states of the old Confederacy. The map will still be very red in presidential and Senate elections. The party will still be able to win 20 states, sometimes more, but they will only be able to rely on low population states. In this future, a quarter century from now, the Republican Party still commands 40-something Senate seats, but they are down to fewer than 100 seats in the House. America has still arrived at what is essentially a single-party system, although under the Democratic Party.
Okay, alright. I don't think the Democrats could be worse than the Republicans.
Single-party systems are still not good, and it would not be good for the Democrats. Consider that right now the Democratic left has never been stronger, and the Democratic right never weaker. The only reason that right-leaning Democrats have any power is that the majorities in Congress are so thin that a handful of conservatives determine whether legislation can advance. Furthermore, in this future, the GOP is still the ruling party in about 20 states, and competitive in a few more. This will keep the risk of a GOP takeover of the Senate alive. Even without a majority, the GOP will still be able to make appeals to conservative Democratic senators to block progressive legislation, and there will be more conservative Democrats. In a hypothetical future with a dominant Democratic Party, conservatives who aspire to a political career will join it. This will dilute the power of the party's left and moderate factions. The result could be a Democratic Party tasked with facing the challenges of global warming, ecological collapse, and resource depletion, challenges for which only radical solutions are liable to work, at a time when the party itself is becoming more conservative. This is not good for America, and not good for the planet. While this is an improvement over an American political scene dominated by a fascist G.O.P, it is still not an ideal outcome. Democrats have long dreamed of a blue Texas, and they will often get it in this scenario, but the focus should be on what the party can accomplish, not on how blue the map is. This scenario still leaves America in political paralysis because the balance of power in the Senate will still be determined by the Joe Manchins of the future. This essentially recreates the power dynamic of the coalition of Republicans and conservative Southern Democrats we saw in the New Deal era. That coalition successfully blocked a lot of reforms that could have improved the lives of Americans. So those are two futures. One, an authoritarian America, the other, a paralyzed America.
Oh, talking to you is so depressing. You should call yourself the Oracle of Gloom.
Well, I've only presented you with two futures. I have a third to offer.
Another gloomy one?
It's a good one.
It better be a good one.
It may not be what you expect.
It's not a good one, is it?
No, it's okay.
From everything you've told me so far, I'm convinced we're
As stated earlier, political parties usually respond to electoral defeat by seeking more votes from the political center. The Republican Party has decided not to do this, instead opting to seek votes from the far-right political fringe. The result is a political party whose leader is very unpopular with anyone who's not a Republican. 2/3 of Americans do not want to see Trump return in 2024. 2/3 of Republicans want him to be their nominee in 2024. No political party has tied themselves this tightly to a losing presidential candidate since the Democrats embraced three-time loser William Jennings Bryan 120 years ago. Still, there are signs this could change. 2/3 in favor of Trump still means 1/3 not in favor. A recent straw poll showed Trump with an approval rating second to that of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. There is a substantial, though currently powerless, Never Trump faction within the GOP. Republicans had to replace their number 3 in the House because of her heresy. So some of the necessary elements to end Trump's hold on the Republican Party are already present. If the Republican Party can get rid of Trump, it may return to being a normal conservative party. What I mean is, conservatism by its very nature wants to conserve, to protect, the status quo. An ordinary right-leaning party argues against the left's efforts to improve the human condition by claiming that things are already as good as they can get, so why tamper with perfection? Where injustice exists, it is simply a feature of the natural order of things, and it's wrong to go against the natural order. In contrast, the Trumpist Republican Party considers the United States hopelessly corrupt. The source of this corruption? Multiculturalism, anti-racism, feminism, take your pick. Even the police who defended the Capitol and the military who stand by their oaths to the Constitution are corrupted. This is the worldview voiced by Glenn Elmers in the conservative Claremont Institute's magazine, The American Mind. Elmers begins his essay stating baldly what Trumpists have long implied. Most people living in the United States today, certainly more than half, are not Americans in any meaningful sense of the term. The only real Americans are the 75 million people who voted in the last election against the senile figurehead of a party that stands for mob violence, ruthless censorship, and racial grievances. Actually, Biden got more than 81 million votes, and it's nice of you to admit that the people who voted against Trump are real Americans. Oh, you meant to call Biden senile and the Democrats the party of racial grievances. Project much, Elmers? My point is, the GOP is not normal conservatism. Republican thought leaders routinely admit their belief that a majority of people living in the United States today can no longer be considered fellow citizens, and that the Republican Party needs voting restrictions to win. It wasn't that long ago that they claimed to represent a silent majority of Americans. So what happens when the GOP goes up against the majority of Americans and loses, as the party experiences one loss after another? While it is possible they would shrink to a regional remnant with outsized influence in the Senate, there is a conservative core ripe for revolt. There are a number of factors that can contribute to Trumpist defeat. Some of these lie within the Republican Party itself. These factors may allow the party's conservative minority to reassert itself. For example, Trump's claims of electoral fraud may play a part in giving Democrats future victories by convincing GOP voters that elections are rigged against them, so why bother showing up? Voter suppression efforts sometimes provoke a backlash, with voting rights groups springing up to get people whose voting rights are threatened properly registered. If someone tries to take away your right to vote, even if you're not a regular voter, you might get pretty angry. And as right-wing propaganda has demonstrated, Angry people are motivated people. So this, then, is another possible scenario. As the Republican Party suffers one defeat after another, discontent within the party builds up. At some point, conservatives have enough power to move against the reactionaries who dominate the party. One possibility is splitting off from the G.O.P. to form a third party dedicated to traditional conservatism. Now, we've seen in the last few decades that American third parties are good only for throwing an election to whichever party can remain unified. Third-party efforts by Southern conservatives in the middle of the 20th century only helped Democrats win. Third-party efforts on the left in the last 25 years have only helped Republicans win. However, a moribund party with a cohesive core might become viable as it attracts ideological fellow travelers. This worked in the 1850s when most of the Whig Party fell away, leaving a core around which the nascent Republican Party could form. In this scenario, after a number of electoral defeats for the party, the conservatives split from the Trumpists, taking half the party's voters with them. The Trumpist Republican Party will not take kindly to this. The two halves compete with each other, and with Democrats, so Trumpists and conservatives both suffer further electoral defeat as they split the vote on the right. Trumpist extremism, frequently expressed through violence, turns off more and more voters, so the Trumpist half shrinks into irrelevancy. The surviving half is a conservative party that actually has conservative principles, a party that will appeal to emerging conservative politicians who will join it instead of the Democratic Party. This process of split and defeat will take time to play out. In that time, a Democratic Party with an agenda set by a progressive and a moderate faction working together, with a conservative faction too small to do damage, can make real progress in improving the human condition. This is, of course, something that conservatives have tried to avoid. A demonstration that government can be used to improve human lives, but once it's demonstrated, as in the New Deal era, it tends to remain unchallenged for a decade or two.
Unchallenged? I can't imagine Republicans letting anything Democrats do go unchallenged.
Republicans had a hard time bouncing back after their electoral defeats in the 30s and 40s. By the time they were able to win Congress and the White House in 1952, they were essentially campaigning as the party who could manage the government more responsibly. They didn't particularly like New Deal programs, but the programs were popular, and they could not hope to win by promising to dismantle them.
You seriously think this future Republican Party will leave progressive programs alone?
If the legislation works and is popular, they won't have a choice. Look how hard they tried to kill Obamacare, only to be thwarted by moderates on their own side. It's either that, or the party remains an ideologically pure regional remnant of a once national party.
So what do we do?
These are three futures for the GOP: triumph, diminution, and redemption. There is a spectrum of possibilities between them. The worst, obviously, is Republican triumph. This must be prevented, or the next 40 years will be so bad that humanity as a species may not survive them.
Again, what do we do?
We have to embrace potential allies, even ones with whom we have fundamental philosophical disagreements. Fascism can triumph when there's no popular front to oppose it. In Germany, through the 1920s and 1930s, socialists, communists, and centrists refused to set aside their differences and unite against the common threat. We need the left, liberals, centrists, and conservatives to come together against the threat of the Republican Party. We can't electorally compete with each other if Republicans put an end to elections.
Conservatives are the ones who kept inviting racists and reactionaries into their party.
I know.
And centrists are the ones who keep claiming both sides are equally bad.
I know.
And liberals want to change things a little, but never enough.
I know. And there's a lot of us on the left who would rather complain than get involved in the messy world of electoral politics for fear of damaging our brand purity. We don't have time for recriminations. We don't have time to assign blame. We have to mobilize and win elections.
Not something Democrats are actually good at. They don't exactly inspire hope.
The Democrats' leaders are old. Really old. And hidebound in their thinking. But right now, for the first time, the Democrats' left and moderate factions are almost equal in size. America has never had a major political party that was invested in opposing white supremacy. There is a whole new generation of activists pushing their way into the party. And whatever their flaws, the Democrats are our only vehicle for defeating the Republican Party. I know, it's a challenge. We're trying to build something that hasn't really existed before, a multi-ethnic democratic republic with no particular ethnicity in charge, and we have to build it with the tools we have on hand. Some of our tools, like the Democratic Party, don't exactly have the best track record.
The Democratic leadership is full of tools.
Oh hush. My point is, we have to set aside our differences, our disappointments, and our resentments, and unite against the GOP. Given the chance, they will end America as a democratic republic. Republicans have been surprisingly open about their intentions. We've had many elected Republicans point out that they need voting restrictions to win. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton claimed that Joe Biden would have won Texas in 2020 if the state had not blocked absentee voting during the pandemic. In 2012, Republican state legislators in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin claimed that their new voting restrictions would enable their presidential candidate to carry their states. The chairman of Florida State G.O.P. claimed early voting had to be restricted because early voting is not good for us. The Speaker of Georgia's House of Representatives, a Republican, claimed in 2020 that expanded mail balloting would be devastating to the GOP. U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham has come right out and said, if Republicans don't challenge and change the U.S. election system, there will never be another Republican president elected again.
I'm willing to work for that. So once again, what do we do?
Electorally, there are two stages. First, elect more Democrats.
But Democrats are in charge right now and they're not doing anything.
If there were 55 Democrats in the Senate instead of 50, Joe Manchin and other conservative Democrats would not be holding back the Democratic agenda. The second stage is elect better Democrats. This means, where possible, replacing the sclerotic old guard.
Will it work?
So far, it has pushed the party further left than it's been in a couple of decades. It's very slow progress, but then of course it took many years for the far right to take over the GOP. We have to think long-term, like they did. It works, and in this case, it's our best chance for preserving American democracy.
The GOP is such a big threat to democracy. Why not Democrats just say so?
Some are. Those are the ones pushing for electoral reform, judicial reform, and abolition of the Senate filibuster. But others are concerned that sounding the alarm will turn off low-information voters who otherwise might lean Democratic.
That's so stupid.
There's a belief that some voters vote Democratic because they are turned off by the GOP's obvious lies. But Republican behavior is so outrageous that telling the truth about them sounds like slander. The stakes are so high that some Democrats are afraid to make a move for fear of making the wrong move, and other Democrats are pretending there's nothing wrong.
If the GOP wins because of these idiots,
we have to make certain they don't. I've told you we need to elect more and better Democrats. In between elections, we need activism to put pressure on them to do the right thing. Elections aren't the final goal. Getting good policy enacted is the goal. The point of elections is to put in office people who can be pressured by activists. In between elections, we pressure them.
That sucks. I don't want to have to pay this much attention to politics.
A Republican victory would mean you wouldn't have to. Decisions would be made for you. They aren't susceptible to pressure from us. There's something you haven't asked me. Are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they shadows of things that may be?
Yeah, but I wouldn't ask it like that.
Then ask it your way.
What's gonna happen?
Futures don't happen. Our actions bring them about. I told you, America's fate will be determined by what the GOP does and how Americans respond to it.
A straightforward answer would be nice.
Always in motion is the future.
Thanks, Yoda.
Honestly, a coalition of country club millionaires, religious fanatics, and libertarian greedheads all dedicated to enforcing the economic status quo was never going to turn out well. Especially once its dedication to preserving the social order, with all its injustices, began attracting white supremacists. Either we unite in a popular front to vote out the Republican Party, or the Republican Party will destroy this country.
You are real damn cheerful.
Yes, I am. I really believe we can do this. Every state can have a Stacey Abrams mobilizing voters. If you can't find one, be one. Start getting friends and neighbors registered to vote. Let people in Republican-dominated states know how their governments are trying to take away their rights. Get them mad.
I can do mad.
Good. I have shared my vision. Now leave me. I am weary and would fain rest.
What?
Get out. I'm tired.
Why can't you just talk like a normal person?
I am a normal person. All right. Maybe I'm a little bit eccentric.